The occasion is the 50th anniversary year of Unsafe at Any Speed. And the occasion is an opportunity to very briefly look backward and see what it was like in the early 60s here in Washington, D.C. It was pretty barren territory for citizen groups. The lobbies were here. They weren't as great as they are now in terms of number and staff, but they were pretty much all over Capitol Hill and all over the various agencies. I remember when I was going up to one office after another, in the Senate and the House, I could see that there was a pall over anything that was called consumer protection or environmental protection or worker protection. Senator Magnuson, the chair of the powerful Senate Commerce Committee, was considered the business agent on Capitol Hill for all kinds of industries and commerce. I remember trying to call Senate offices, and they would always ask, "Who are you with?" I would call agencies, and they would always say, "Who are you with?" And I'd sort of look around, who am I with? I'm a citizen. One time I was in a parking lot, and I made a call to a senator's office to talk to his staffer, and the receptionist said, "Who are you with?" Luckily, there was a dog that yapped right into the phone, and I heard a click. I guess they weren't amused. But we persisted, and we developed the critical quadrangle of civic success in Washington, D.C. The first is full-time advocates pressing for the change. The second is a reception to public hearings in the House and Senate by the critical chairs. The third is open-mindedness in the White House, not knee-jerk vetoism. And the fourth is the mass media. The mass media, not just reporting, but reflecting and communicating the public sentiment, or to use Abraham Lincoln's words, the public sentiment, or what we say today is majority opinion. So when you have majority opinion and you have a receptive Congress and you have an open-minded White House and you have a media that looks at these issues as regular beats, not just occasional features seeking Pulitzer Prizes or other prizes, you have that critical quadrangle for success. And after the passage in 1966 of the Highway and Motor Vehicle Safety Laws, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson in September 1966, a little over 9 months after Unsafe at Any Speed came out. Imagine the kind of speed that occurred those days in Congress compared to now. After that, there was a profusion of civic activity. Citizen groups were started, others were expanded in the environmental, consumer, worker area, open government. A whole variety of citizen groups opened their doors, brought in young people, interns, brought in people of activity going back to the 1930s, as well as people who honed their skills for the first time in the critical task of seeking justice. I remember in particular the establishment of one agency after another, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, establishing the air and water pollution laws, the critical umbrella air and water pollution laws that continue to this day, and other laws. Guess who signed them? Richard Nixon. Why did Richard Nixon sign them? He didn't believe in them. He had flourishing introductions to them that were really terrific, and he signed one after another because he feared the rumble from the people coming out of the 60s. I might say he's the last Republican president to be afraid of liberals, I might add. And it was the rumble of the people reflecting majority sentiment that radiated toward this national capital and made him sign legislation that, given his ideological predilections, would have been very, very improbable otherwise. So the sequence was an aroused public directing its attention to the commercial interests, telling them they better restrain themselves, focusing on the existing law to elaborate it on political and government institutions, and getting through the media. The importance of the civil society is hard to exaggerate. Looking over American history, it's hard to see any major social justice movement that started from within government or from within business or from within any institution. It started in the hearts and minds of very few people. The people who started the abolition movement against slavery in the late 18th century, early 19th century. The people who started the women's suffrage movement, 6 women meeting in a farmhouse in upstate New York in the 1840s. The sit-down strikes by workers in Flint, Michigan and Warren, Michigan to start the United Auto Workers. Rosa Parks refusing to go to the rear of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama to flash the latest stage of the civil rights movement. It all starts with a few people, and we should never be demoralized by forgetting that historical principle. It all starts with small communities, small groups. What's happened today is the commercialization of our elections, from the profit centers that the present presidential debates have offered to the commercial media like Fox and CNN and others who put on these debates and decided who's going to be in Tier 1 and Tier 2, imagine that, to the super PACs and the business of raising money in order to advance through our electoral process commercial values over civil values. The commercialization of these elections have reached a point in American history where they're off limits to democracy itself. They're off limits to democracy's civil community. The people who are the experts, movers, and shakers in our country, in these civil communities, in these citizen groups, some of which you will see today, are not asked for their participation. They're not asked for their expertise by the media or by the political consultants. When elections are off limits to democracy, a society is in real trouble. The importance of these groups reflect what can be called a civic personality. We've heard of an athletic personality, that athlete who has that nth degree to win. We've heard of the entrepreneurial personality to start new businesses where no one has tread before. But we don't often talk about the civic personality. People who you'll see on this stage throughout the day and day 2, 3, and 4 of this week, which we have called Breaking Through Power, but which also can be called a civic marathon. They have the features of a civic personality. They know how to separate truth from fiction. They know how to be resilient. They know how to repel discouragement. They know how to share credit. They know how to keep up to date on the information. They know how to have patience and long attention spans. They know how to have the short view and the long view. They know how to and like to teach young people who will be their successors. These and others, including a ever more refined strategic and tactical sense, represent a civic personality that no one is really born with. It's something that's learned, It can be taught in our schools, but it is not. It can be taught in terms of on-the-job training. It can be heralded as well. If we had a more rational society in terms of our definition of heroism, we would not only have a Hollywood Academy Awards, we would have a National Civic Achievement Academy Awards. And a lot of the people you'll see on this stage would be nominees for those awards. These are people who could have minimized themselves and continued successfully through life, materially. Instead, they chose to maximize themselves in the great quest for justice, which Senator Daniel Webster once called the great work of human beings on earth. What we have found in terms of the experience of these groups and others around the country is that 1% or less of the population in any congressional district or state legislative district organized and engaged in pursuing a change or a redirection or a reform and reflecting majority opinion is unstoppable. It doesn't matter how powerful corporations think they are, how endangered politicians think they are, it's an unstoppable force. Many of the groups today had far less than 1% organized throughout the country, supporting their efforts on Capitol Hill. That's something to think about, because we hear a lot about the other 1% that rules us, popularized by Occupy Wall Street. But I think it's time to talk about this 1%, that throughout history, it has taken less than 1% in terms of people rolling up their civic sleeves, spending a few hundred hours a year, raising necessary money for full-time staff, and pursuing the strategies for victory. When you look at what these groups have accomplished, I want to compare at the right time what these CEOs have been paid. The entire cumulative budget of all of these groups who will present their life's work before you today, and you'll only get a glimmer of their quality and the quality of their colleagues and what they're up against. The entire cumulative budget is less than the executive compensation of the CEO of Discovery Communications, Gamco Investors, Microsoft Corporation, Oracle Corporation, Lionsgate Entertainment Corporation. What's the lesson from that? The lesson is that there needs to be more investment in justice. There needs to be more investment in these groups and starting new citizen groups and planting the seeds for a more intense forest of democracy. Justice needs money. The abolition movement was funded significantly by rich Bostonians and New Yorkers. The women's suffrage movement drew on rich Philadelphians, among others. In the 1950s, the civil rights and environmental movements in the 60s drew on families such as the Stern family from Louisiana and the Curry family from Virginia. We'd like to have some enlightened, very wealthy people recognize that their legacy to America is not in their material accomplishments. Their respect for posterity is not what they bequeath to their descendants, that their legacy to America is to unfurl the civic and political energies of the American people, to turn our country into what it can be, and what it can be overseas as well. Finally, I want to conclude by urging all of you to spread the word. By your appearance today and watching it on live stream, you have pre-selected yourselves in terms of interest and commitment, reflecting your own civic energies. It's important for us to have a resurgence of civic activism. After years of powerful corporate forces turning Washington, D.C. into corporate-occupied territory and throwing so many of the citizen groups on the defensive, it's important for you to spread the word, not just in the following days here, on day 2, breaking through the media. Day 3, breaking through war, waging peace over waging war. Peace is powerful, war is weak. And day 4, on Thursday, May 26th, breaking through Congress, the single most important branch of government by far, and the one that only has 535 men and women who put their shoes on like you and I do every day, but who have to understand that their power comes from we the people, the preamble to our Constitution, which does not read we the corporations or we the Congress. It reads we the people. Turning that institution around with less than 1% organized back home, reflecting public sentiment and long overdue changes in our country and its impact on the world, will revolutionize the aspirations for the urgent development of a deep democracy.
Karen Friedman, she's the longtime policy director, executive vice president of the Pension Rights Center, but she's also a stand-up comedian. That's pretty rare in the public interest world. Of course, dealing with these thieving corporate pension people, you've got to have some sort of comic outlet at the end of the day, I think. And she, for 25 years, Karen, has been fighting for consumers, retirees, and particularly low and moderate wage folks who either are shut out from pensions or literally have their pensions taken from them.
Today I'm going to talk about the naked truth. So I'm so happy to be here on the opening day of Breaking Through Power. It's an amazing event, right? First, I want to thank Ralph Nader and all the hardworking staff from the Center for the Study of Responsive Law who put this together. This is a really impressive event. So I'm here today to tell you about how the Pension Rights Center has been breaking through power for 40 years and how it's paid off. And Ralph before talked about rumbling. Well, we have to do some rumbling here today. So what is the Pension Rights Center? And make sure that these are working. Hello. Ah, there it is. Great. So we're a national consumer rights organization that's been working since 1976 to promote and protect retirement security for workers, retirees, and their families. We have a vision that when people leave the workforce, they have enough money to pay their bills, pay their medical expenses, and continue to be productive citizens. Because guess what, guys? If people have adequate income, they're more likely to be able to continue fighting for justice throughout their lives. So the Pension Rights Center really hasn't changed in our 40 years, but the challenges in some of our strategies have. And that's what I'm talking about today. The Pension Rights Center was started 40 years ago by the amazing pension attorney Karen Ferguson when the visionary Ralph Nader said, "Karen, go make pensions an issue, and here's a check to do it." Karen Ferguson is actually still working today. She's still the director, been working for 40 years. So I am Karen Friedman, and the executive vice president, and I'm known as Karen number 2. And when people talk about the Pension Rights Center, they typically talk about the Karens. We've been working together for roughly 25 out of the 40 years, and I have a passion for pensions, and I hope you will too by the time I finish this speech. So, many of you in this room may have seen the new movie out, Superman, Batman, Dawn of Justice, which is actually a pretty awful film. But the reason I bring it up is because we in this country are obsessed with superheroes who fly in, conquer evil, and solve our problems. But here's the truth, folks. There's never one person who does everything. Leaders inspire, but all of us are needed in the fight. So I'm here to say today that we are the superwomen, we are the supermen who together can solve this country's problems. And after this conference, I propose that we write and produce our own movie, Super Activists, Dawn of Justice, How Ordinary People Saved the World. And that could be part of Ralph's Civil Justice Academy Awards. What do you think about that? And that is exactly what this conference is about. So, right now, I'm going to tell you how the Pension Rights Center, with a strong mission, a small budget, but tons of passion, has helped change laws and regulations, and even in some cases, we've changed how both companies and pension plans operate. So, why was the Pension Rights Center started? So, put on your time travel glasses, and let's fly back to the year 1976. That was the year disco music was filling the airwaves, President Carter was elected president, and to put it all in perspective, Angelina Jolie was still in diapers. Most importantly, at least from our perspective, it was 2 years after the passage of the new federal private pension law, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, better known as ERISA, which protects the reasonable pension expectations of workers and retirees. The landmark law, ERISA, was developed by a bipartisan Congress and signed into law by Republican President Gerald Ford, and was called by the Republican Senator Javits, who was one of the lead sponsors of ERISA, one of the most important pieces of social legislation since Social Security. Before ERISA, tens of thousands of people were losing their pensions every day because there were few laws regulating pension plans, and companies could do pretty much whatever they wanted. They could require people to work until retirement age to get their pensions, and then fire them 2 days before their 65th birthday. Bye-bye pensions. Employers could invest the money in those days in bogus casinos in Vegas, facing no consequences. And if a company in those days, this is prior to 1974, went bankrupt, workers could lose everything. So ERISA created basic standards to protect pension promises, including creating a pension insurance program to protect people in bankruptcy, developing investment and funding rules, and setting minimum rules on how long people needed to work to earn the right to a pension. But like all laws that are duked out between different parties and stakeholders, ERISA wasn't perfect. There were many gaps, and Congress could not envision all the problems that could occur. So step in the Pension Rights Center. The Pension Rights Center, from the earliest days, helped people understand their rights under the law, and we began hearing from people, as soon as we started, who were left out of the law. And over time, we documented those issues. There were widows and divorced spouses who learned they weren't eligible to get their husband's pensions, even if they had been married for decades. There were corporate raiders. Some of you may remember Carl Icahn of 1980s fame, who found ways of looting so-called surplus pension assets to finance takeover schemes. There were folks who worked 9 years and 8 months but lost their jobs before the 10 years they needed to earn the right to a pension. So, To solve these and other problems, the Pension Rights Center did what we now consider our stock and trade. We did it then, we do it now. We identified and documented problems. We used our technical know-how to develop workable solutions. And then we mobilized affected citizens and women's organizations, labor unions, retiree groups in coalition for the passage of laws. We were, and consider ourselves now, to be the great catalyst for retirement income reform. So, over our history, the Pension Rights Center, and I won't go through all of these, we were instrumental in passing 6 federal laws and in helping to implement numerous regulations to expand benefits and rights for widows, divorced spouses, low-income earners, short-service workers, to stop pension raiding, and to help create a legal help network. But this is what I really want to talk about today. What are the strategies for change? How did we pass these laws? Well, I want to start by saying you have to have the facts, and you have to have the know-how, but you also need to get creative, especially when you're small and under-resourced, which I think every organization you're hearing from today is. So I thought I'd share a few stories of how we got laws passed in our first few decades. Back in the 1980s, we got the widows and divorced spouses who were left out of ERISA featured on the Phil Donahue Show, which in those days was the hottest talk show and generated all kinds of buzz. We used the power of these stories to get to Congress. For instance, we arranged for Pat Tice to testify before the Ways and Means Committee about how women would lose their survivors' pensions if their husbands died at the wrong time. She came and she talked in this soft voice and she said, "I came today because I thought I could be helped by the legislation to protect widows, but it's too late for me. My husband died this morning. I showed up today to help others." Can you imagine this? You could have heard a pin drop. Suffice it to say, Congress soon passed the Retirement Equity Act. To draw attention to pension looting, we delivered cookies to all the key members of Congress saying, "Stop companies from stealing from the pension cookie jar." And one of my favorites in the 1990s, when IBM tried to cut its older workers' benefits, employees flew a blimp over a football stadium saying, "IBM stole my pension, is yours safe?" And faced with a bad PR campaign, IBM actually changed its practice for a lot of those employees, and Congress ended up changing the law. So when you think about social change, think facts, think solutions, but think creativity. Today, especially in this media-saturated market, it's more important than ever. So now let's move to the present time and see what we're doing now. As you can imagine, 40 years later, the retirement landscape has changed, and there are more challenges than ever. At $16.5 trillion, oh, sorry about that, I just went the wrong way, okay. At $16.5 trillion, pensions are one of the world's largest sources of private capital. And we as taxpayers subsidize the private system of pensions and 401ks to the tune of $132 billion. So you're all sitting here and you're listening to us and you're saying, with that much money in the pension system, it must be doing a great job for people, right? Well, it isn't. While policymakers talk incessantly about the budget deficit in this country, there's little talk about a huge and growing retirement income deficit, which is now standing at $7.7 trillion. $7.7 trillion. The retirement income deficit, which was calculated by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, is the gap between what people have saved as of today and what they should have saved as of today to meet their basic retirement needs. So, what has caused this retirement deficit? About half the private workforce has no pensions or savings to supplement Social Security, which is averaging about $16,000 a year for the average retiree and less for low-income workers and women. Employers are dropping, cutting back, or freezing good old-fashioned pension plans which promote a specific benefit at retirement in favor of 401k plans, which really haven't cracked it for most Americans. In fact, half of all households with 401k plans have only $59,000 accumulated in their accounts. And for people approaching retirement, it's closer to $103,000, which isn't enough to make it through retirement. And consider this. For all households, not just those with retirement accounts, they have saved about $2,500, $2,500. And it's worse for workers of color. Now, the national opinion polls reflect America's anxiety. A recent Gallup poll shows that Americans are more worried about not having money for retirement than any other economic issue, including paying for health care, their mortgage, or their kids' education. So the Pension Rights Center is working every day to try to develop solutions to address this retirement income deficit and protect against broken pension promises. To address the lack of pension coverage in this country, the Pension Rights Center has called for a new national universal secure and adequate pension system on top of Social Security. And we strongly support the expansion of Social Security, and we're also working for new creative solutions both in the state and national level. We are also ensuring that retirees and workers already earned pensions are protected. We're seeing new trends every day where consulting firms advise corporations on how to cut pensions and other benefits by taking advantage of loopholes in the law, by offloading pensions to insurance companies, and we're even seeing something in recent years where nonprofit hospitals with a loose connection with, say, a church or a synagogue have worked to convert their federally protected pension plans into unprotected church plans, endangering the pensions of millions of workers and retirees. And on this last issue, because of the research done by the Pension Rights Center, there's now 12 lawsuits, many of which have been decided in workers and retirees' favor. Now I'm going to spend the last part of my speech talking about two victories in 2016 where the Pension Rights Center and our allies stood up to power and we won. And this is really important, the winning parts. So these are all of our activists. This is about winning, guys. So lots of people now say, Karen, come on, it's impossible to have victories now in this divided Congress. Well, with grassroots support and enough diverse stakeholders, we believe that certain legislative victories even today are possible. But we have seen also great things happen, guys, in the regulatory arena. We had two big successes this year that I wanted to share with you. The first is about stopping predatory practices in the financial advice industry. The Pension Rights Center and allies such as AARP, Consumer Federation of America, the AFL-CIO joined together in a coalition called Save Our Retirement to stand up against the multi-million-dollar lobby of the financial industry. And we won a great victory for American consumers. For the last 5 years, brokers and financial institutions fought vigorously to stop the Department of Labor from releasing a common ground rule that ensures that brokers and financial advisors who give advice on your retirement account has to do so in your interest, not only to line their pockets. Pretty reasonable, right? This conflicted advice, guys, was costing American consumers $17 billion a year. But of course, the industry fought this because they're making big bucks off of giving conflicted advice. But here's the thing, we fought the industry and we won. And how? By bringing together a strong consumer coalition, coordinating technical comments to the agencies, meeting with editorial boards, educating policymakers, doing Twitter campaigns, and being persistent. The battle isn't over because, of course, the financial industry is still lobbying Congress to try to weaken the law. They're threatening lawsuits, the whole thing. But we're confident we can overcome because this is the right result. Another huge victory for retirees and the Pension Rights Center in 2016 was to protect 270,000 retired truck drivers and workers in the Central States Pension Plan who faced pension cuts, ready for this, 40 to 70% because of a terrible law that was passed at the end days of 2014. You guys probably don't even know about this. Congress, in the dead of the night, end of 2014, attached a bill called the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act to an end-year spending bill that allowed certain underfunded pension plans to slash the benefits of retirees in order to fix underfunded plans. This was unprecedented and torpedoed the most fundamental protections of ERISA. Suddenly, retirees who'd done everything right, had given up wages, vacation pay, in exchange for a lifetime pension, learned that these unbreakable pensions that they earned were about to be broken and their lives devastated. We knew that these cuts had to be stopped. So working with thousands of truck drivers, spouses and widows, and warehouse workers and others, certain unions and ARP, we developed a campaign to both try to change the law, but also to influence the Treasury Department, which was given authority to review these cuts. We used the tactics that I talked about earlier, the tactics that we've always used, but updated. We analyzed the law and posted plain English summaries on our website. When thousands of retirees contacted us, we helped them provide them with information, and they put it on their own Facebook pages, and guess what? Now all these retirees have organized themselves into 60 powerful committees in 30 states. In April, the retirees themselves organized a rally outside the Capitol with 2,000 retirees, spouses, and widows calling for Treasury to reject the Central States application and for Congress to pass a bill that would repeal the bill that was passed in 2014 and stop these cuts. In an amazing victory for consumers, the Treasury Department, after receiving thousands of comments from retirees, the pension rights centers, labor and retiree advocates, rejected the application for sound legal reasons. So while Congress passed a law in 2014 behind closed doors that failed retirees, the regulatory process protected them. This is democracy at work. And now we and the retirees are pushing for repeal of that terrible 2014 bill. And we're pushing for a bill that was actually introduced called the Keep Our Pension Promises Act by Senator Sanders and Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur from stopping these cuts. But this is the thing that I really think is critical for this conference. The thousands of former truck drivers are now effective citizen activists. This is what they do every day. They email me 100 times a day. They have become the best lobbyists I've ever seen. And they have inspired the Pension Rights Center to work even harder. So I want to just say, remember my story about Pat Tice from 1984? Well, 32 years later, Rita Lewis, a widow from Ohio, testified before the Senate Finance Committee, and she changed the hearts and minds. Rita, whose late husband Butch was injured in Vietnam and then drove a truck for 40 years, testified how 40% proposed cuts to her survivor's pension would force her to sell her house and stop her from taking care of her dad who had stage 4 cancer. She was so effective, again, you could hear a pin drop. Her testimony was called the most powerful that members had heard in the committee and led to a commitment for senators of both parties to work toward bipartisan legislation. And the Democrats also all wrote a letter asking for a bill. So this is democracy in action, guys. We are the supermen, we are the superwomen of the citizen action movement. So please join with the Pension Rights Center in our larger movement for retirement security for all, for today's and future retirees, to protect pensions made to people in all pension plans, protect and increase Social Security, work with us to repeal the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act, work with us to help create a universal, secure, and adequate pension system for all people, and let's keep fighting.
A guy I've known for approximately 40 years, we both started in the public interest movement roughly the same time, the 1970s. He stuck with it while I fell off into the sinful world of politics, but he has been a giant in the public interest world. Michael Jacobson is the head of the Center for Science in the Public Interest, where he's done health advocacy. His nutrition newsletter has 700,000 subscribers to it. He's engaged in all sorts of obesity fights. He's taken on Coke and Kellogg and all the rest of them. He drives them absolutely crazy. Of course, that's a pretty short ride for a number of them, if you think about it. He does it through education, legislation, litigation, agitation too. You got to remember that the agitator is the center post in the washing machine that gets the dirt out. We need more agitators, and Mike Jacobson is one of the best in our country.
You know, I came to Washington, volunteered with Ralph Nader. My first day on the job, I sit around with Ralph and a few of his aides, and Ralph says, okay, what are we going to do with this guy? He's got a PhD from MIT. And is that a good enough imitation, Ralph? And so one of the people sitting there was Jim Turner, who just that week was publishing a book called Chemical Feast about the Food and Drug Administration and its various failures and inadequacies. So this guy and Ralph said, okay, Jacobson, why don't you write a book about food additives? So I just come out of grad school studying a virus. I knew nothing about writing books, no idea about even what a food additive was. And I said, well, okay, guys, I'd be glad to do it, but how do you write a book and what's a food additive? And so they said, just go and do it. And it seemed like everybody on his staff was writing a book that year. So I scurried to the library, looked up what a food additive was. I don't think there was a book on how do you write a book, but I put my nose to the grindstone and wrote that book, which was novel back then because there were other books on food additives, but they were of, I don't know, it's like they came out of the 1930s or something. The authors had to prove that every food additive was dangerous. And, I mean, they clearly aren't. And so I wrote what I thought was an intellectually honest book. And my conclusion was that food additives, like the sodium nitrite and the artificial flavorings, weren't nearly as big a problem as the foods themselves. All the sugar and the fat and the salt, and as my grandmother, unlike Jim Hightower's grandmother, would say, all the chazarai in the foods. So I wrote the book, Eater's Digest, and meanwhile, I had met two other scientists working with Ralph, Jim Sullivan and Al Fritsch, and you'll hear Al Fritsch talk this afternoon. And we decided to split off and start our own organization, the Center for Science in the Public Interest. We had no connections, no money, and somehow, though, it worked out. Al is a priest, so he had free rent from the church, and Jim and I lived in group houses, and we managed okay. And we gradually wrote books and articles and pamphlets, got little grants that kept us going. As the previous speaker, Karen, mentioned the idea of using mass media, and the media are so different then from now. Phil Donahue, who might be on this program later in the week, was just an angel in inviting public interest people onto a show and letting them advertise their products, their memberships or newsletters. And we had posters back then on food additives and nutrition, and we'd be on a show and sell thousands and thousands of posters. And newspaper columnists would write articles saying, talking about the issue and then saying, get this pamphlet for $1.50 or whatever. And we'd sell thousands and thousands. Coleman McCarthy, another speaker in the series Breaking Through Power, wrote a column about one of the things we wrote, and we literally had mail sacks of orders for the publication sitting outside our front door. So we lived on that sort of a thing. Then we started Nutrition Action Health Letter as a giveaway little newsletter for nutritionists who were somewhat progressive. And then after a year, we decided we couldn't afford to give it away for free anymore, so we started charging and gradually built that up into a real powerhouse of a newsletter. It's the largest largest circulation health newsletter in the country now, with about 700,000 subscribers. And that's been the basis of our existence. And we've been so fortunate because we are lousy grant getters, but we write a pretty good newsletter. And so subscribers and some of the subscribers donate extra money. That's been the backbone of our financial support. And it's been very satisfying to have it under our control rather than having to beg foundations all the time. But if any of you are here, we'd love to have your money also. So, and you get a free newsletter subscription if you donate. So now we have 700,000 subscribers and about income of about $15 million a year, much of which goes to the post office and the printer. But as I was thinking, you saw Ralph's slide of executive salaries. $15 million is what the president of Coca-Cola got last year. And that was after a 40% pay cut. He was making $25 million, but he's down to $15 million. And the president of Pepsi, Indra Nooyi, makes a cool $26 million. But getting back to the substance, one of my conclusions from the book was that, writing the book, was that nutrition is more important than the food additives, though they are significant and very interesting, and we've kept working on those ever since. Back then, the mantra of the nutrition establishment, the Department of Agriculture, the American Dietetic Association, the food industry, and others, was a very convenient, self-serving, all food is good food, just eat a variety of foods and you'll be okay. So when I began looking into this, and I really knew almost nothing about nutrition, I began looking into it, and that clearly wasn't the case. And there was a shift going on from some professors, the American Heart Association a little bit, recognizing that the saturated fat and cholesterol and salt and some other things in food were major causes of heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, diabetes. And there was controversy, but the whole conversation was shifting, as it shifted in many other fields that you'll hear during the conference series, from deficiencies of micronutrients to excesses of certain nutrients in our food. And that's what we've been working on ever since, to try to improve the quality of the American diet. And partly by educating the public, which I think is essential, but more by focusing on the kind of garbage that companies were producing and that government was defending. And I remember one debate I had. We used to give out the Bon Vivant Vichyssoise Memorial Award, given to the biggest junk food producer of the year. And we'd give it out at the convention of the Institute of Food Technologists, who are the people that create all this junk. And so I'm outside the convention, being in the award was a beat-up old garbage can. So I had the garbage can. NPR is interviewing me, and I'm saying, all processed food is junk food, as only a very committed young man can say with such fervor. And so right after I'm doing the interview, somebody from General Foods rushes up to the NPR reporter and says, "It's not true, it's not true." And the reporter gives him the microphone and says, "Well, tell us about the foods, good, healthy foods that General Foods is marketing." And he says, well, we're working on one right now. And I think made it very easy to win the debate. So a couple of years later, I had the idea that too much salt was harmful because there's a lot of evidence, even back in the 1970s. So a young woman just started work for us, Bonnie Liebman, in 1977, and I said, Bonnie, let's write a petition to the Food and Drug Administration about salt, and that the government should limit sodium levels in food, put warning notices on canisters of salt, and a couple of other things. And back then, salt, and now salt, is considered generally recognized as safe. Companies could use as much as they want. So Bonnie and I and Georgetown Law School wrote the petition, and we've been working on salt ever since. The government has done virtually nothing on salt. Researchers, though, have been busy discovering that if we could cut sodium from salt and other food additives by 50%, that could save as many as 100,000 lives a year and $20 billion or so every year in medical costs. You know, just an issue of enormous importance. And meanwhile, salt is generally recognized as safe. And it's one of those issues that everybody here, all Americans know that it's safe. You know, it's on our tables. We wouldn't have anything dangerous on our tables that wasn't safe. So we've been working at it. We petitioned the FDA in 1978. We sued the FDA in 1982 for not taking any action. We lost in 1983 and went on to other things like getting that nutrition facts label on foods. And then we thought maybe, well, sodium would be listed on the label, every food, maybe that would get companies to lower sodium levels, consumers to choose less. But in 2005, we discovered that people were consuming as much sodium in 2005 as they were in 1978 when we started this campaign. So we went back to court. The court said, you got to petition the FDA again, which we did in 2005, and waited for a response. Got the Institute of Medicine to do a study that said that the report said that the food industry said it would reduce sodium levels voluntarily. Government urged voluntary reduction since 1969, and for the past 40 years there was no progress whatsoever, and that the Food and Drug Administration should set formal limits. So that was 2011. The FDA immediately said, we're not going to set limits, basically because the food industry wouldn't let it, but it would set voluntary targets. So 2011, we've been waiting for these voluntary targets, so we finally sued the FDA again to respond to our petition. That was last October. And we expect a response in about 10 days, so keep your eye on that, and I think that the Food and Drug Administration will probably will propose voluntary targets, not mandatory, and then we're going to go through some long phase. But it's the first time the FDA has taken any real action to lower sodium levels, and hopefully the food industry will go along with them. And that's typical. These big things, every food company uses salt. Every restaurant has salty foods. These issues take a long, long time. There's a tremendous industry resistance. One of the things that happened quickly in this scheme of things is trans fat. Back in 1990, there was almost no evidence that trans fat was harmful. And then careful research showed that it raised the bad cholesterol in food, lowered in our blood, and lowered the good cholesterol. And that was the first human study done by the Department of Agriculture. And trans fat comes from partially hydrogenated oil, which, like salt, has been considered generally recognized as safe. And that's been an interesting issue. It went on we petitioned FDA in 1994, went through the usual public meetings and hearings and debates, then lawsuits, and finally in 2006 the FDA required trans fat on labels, which spurred a lot of companies to remove it. And finally last year the FDA banned partially hydrogenated oil and trans fat with a deadline of 2018. But 90% of trans fat, thank you. 90% of trans fat is out of the food supply. More than 7 billion pounds of partially hydrogenated oil has been removed. And I think everybody from the food manufacturers, the seed developers, farmers, everybody deserves some credit for that enormous change in our food supply. And the next one is sugar. I should say trans fat was causing upwards of 50,000 deaths per year, premature deaths per year. None of those heart attacks had a label that said trans fat, which makes it very difficult to deal with, hard to get the victims to be spokespersons. Sugar is another biggie. Just soda pop is killing about 25,000 Americans each year. And it's something that the battle lines have been drawn. Soda consumption is down by 27% since 1998, when we first really started working on this. Enormous change. And Indra Nooyi, president of Pepsi, $25 million a year. Pepsi sales have declined by 50% since 1998. And I would pay her money, a lot of money, to drive sales down further. So we'll see what happens. But I see my time's running out. I just wanted to mention a couple of the challenges. We're not eating more fruits and vegetables, despite all the farmers markets and Michael Pollan's and propaganda. It's ridiculous. We need to develop effective campaigns to improve the consumption of fruits and vegetables, which are protective of health. And more broadly, this citizens movement in the food area needs to do what it's doing in many other areas. Keep the pressure on industry. They will respond to public pressure, whether it's over the web, in newspapers, or with your shopping dollars at supermarkets. And I think they deserve applause from time to time for doing the right thing. The greatest strength of the citizens movement is facts and credibility, and then persistence. You got to keep at this basically forever, because the opponents are going to come back. You know, it's kind of like the ocean and building sandcastles. The ocean's going to continue trying to come back and remove what you've done. But it's very gratifying to work on public interest issues because you can have an impact. You're really protecting the public.